Greetings and welcome back to my channel, World War II Books, Where to Start. I'm your host, Prime Minister John Curtin, reporting live from Canberra, where I'm expectantly waiting on MacArthur, who has stopped off at Alice Springs for some stupid reason. And if he ever finds his way here, well, we've got a lot to talk about for war strategy. But in the meantime, let's run through some reports I've been receiving about the war in the South Pacific and see how we're faring in this titanic struggle south of the equator. And let's try to steer a course towards victory. And so now, let's hit the books. Okay, first up, Japan Runs Wild by Paul Harmsen from 2019, 217 pages total, so this is a thin one. So I've now completed the Harmsen trilogy, but I've read it out of order, rebel that I am. Stunningly consistent throughout his efforts, he trades off the set pieces of the war with the obscure and little-known stuff with some great tidbits to lead you on to other reading in the Pacific and CBI theaters. In the other volumes, he's handled the set pieces very well, but here, aside from Equator, he kind of makes a hash of Coral Sea and bobbles midway, and it's really a bit of a head-scratcher. How could you fumble two of the best-known and extensively written about battles of the Pacific War? But because this is a fast-paced general history, it doesn't stick around long enough to bother you for very long. Guadalcanal does well. As one of the concluding chapters on Terra, he does well. In between, there are tantalizing tidbits, such as A guy named Patrick Stanley Von Heenan, a New Zealander and captain in the British Indian Army, who is believed to have been recruited by the Japanese as an agent while on extended leave in Japan in the 30s. During the early stages of the Japanese offensive in Malaya, he used a radio they had given him to send information regarding aircraft dispositions and missions to the Japanese forces. When discovered, he was arrested, sent to Singapore, and he was then summarily executed in about February, and his body dumped into the harbor. B. Regarding the capture of Singapore, the Kempeitai had orders to round up and murder 50,000 Chinese civilians as swiftly as possible for no real reason other than collective punishment for siding with the Allies. As it eventuated, it's estimated they were able to carry out about half the required number of murders. C. A yacht sailing from Singapore was attacked and, when it was sinking, runs ashore on an island called Bangka. Of the 60 then living British and Australian soldiers and some 22 nurses, when the Japanese troops arrived, the soldiers who could walk were marched around a headland and then machine gunned and bayoneted. When the Japanese soldiers returned to the beach, they then raped the nurses, marched them out into the surf, and machine gunned them, and bayoneted the stretcher cases on the beach. Only one nurse survived, by the name of Vivian Bullwinkle. D. Some small stories from Guadalcanal, such as U.S. Marines beheading Japanese corpses and putting their heads on spikes facing the Japanese lines. A display of how quickly the fighting could break down into sheer medieval-style barbarity on both sides of the battle. E. The Bengal famine is now well known, but I hadn't heard of a famine in China in the Henan province, running from 42 to 43, and which the estimates of those who died run from several 100,000 to perhaps as many as 5 million. The actual figure, still disputed. Harmsen says weather factors such as the El Nino current may have led to the drought which caused famine, and while the famine endured, there was also a plague of locusts to make things worse. People were seen eating wet clay and leaves, and of course there was cannibalism. One woman arrested for that crime was buried alive as punishment and warning to others. See F. A civilian internment camp in Shanghai run by a commandant with an American wife, a redhead. She prevented harsher treatment for the internees, according to some of those who were interned. Couldn't get a name on her. I tried. Couldn't dig one out just yet. G. Java had a death railway too, which I had not run across before. A 100-mile stretch of jungle from a coal mine to a seaport had to be cleared for a railroad track to carry the coal. Locals were recruited semi-voluntarily and then put to the hard task in the normal Japanese Army way, with severe shortages of food, medicine, clothing. They were making clothing out of sacks because their regular clothes had deteriorated in the jungle. You got the usual disease and snake bites and the harsh punishments. Common burial pits were the norm. H. Some small combatant Italian Navy ships and some small numbers of Italian troops and concessions in China had to make a decision when Italy flipped whether they would fight for Japan or surrender and be imprisoned. And likewise, several ships of the Italian Navy and Merchant Marine at sea in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean had to make the same choice, as well as some submarines. Of the subs, someone to the Kriegsmarine U-boat base in Asia, and one decided to surrender to the Brits in South Africa. So there was a good section on the Aleutians as well. All in all, it's right in line with the other two books of the series, and a fine brief general history of the Pacific War. So if you're looking for an intro to that, that's not heavy and won't bog down and protracted campaign dissections, I feel this is the way to go. That's Japan Runs Wild by Peter Harmsen. Lucky 666 by Bob Drury and Tom Clavin for 2016, 368 pages total. Mostly filler with just a tiny bit of killer. It's like that metal band you love so much just dropped a new album and you're all hot and bothered about it, so you snatch up a copy or download it, whatever. But then you discover out of 13 tracks, only 2 are worth a bleep. And that's what we get here. It's a good teaser. And the teaser is like one of the best sections of the book, but it's immediately wiped out with dull filler and backwash about the course of the war in the Pacific, hitting all the milestones, ding, 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 without remorse or pity. Then diverts to MacArthur and the Solomons with all its complications, and only gradually and painstakingly gets back to the subject matter on the cover of the book. Once we have arrived, it's very good, and yet, still a bit superficial, even with follow-up post-war awards and tragedies trailed by the epilogue of what happened to the crew of Old 666. There are plenty of irrelevancies here, and some odd Lincoln quotes thrown in. I suppose it's supposed to sound like really educated and erudite. It's just not convincing. And add to that, there's a myriad of pithy phrases that would be far more at home in a novel than a nonfiction history book. And the one that sticks in my mind is worry twisted in his guts like broken glass. Whew, man, that's deep. That's deep and dramatic, but it doesn't belong here. I will say that if you know next to nothing about the war and find this an intriguing subject, it could be a very illuminating and potentially a fine starting point to digging deeper. But for those of us with any familiarity with the course of events and personalities in the war, this is strictly an exercise in meh, dressed up as awesome. 2 stars. And then we have Sandakan by Paul Ham, from 2012, 550 pages. 556 pages main body. This is a thick one. Paul Ham is an Australian writer and historian who can stir up some controversies from time to time and tends to veer into the category of revisionist at times. There's a couple different flavors of revisionist history to my mind. A, where the researcher comes across new information in the files and the interviews and such to warrant a new look at what's considered a chiseled in stone historical event, such as what Partial and Tully did with their study of Midway, Shattered Sword. And then there's the dark side of revisionism, a la David Irving, where the author rearranges the interpretation of information and known facts to suit their personal political desires. Ham falls between 2 stools here, as the Brits like to say. He can go after obscure or poorly known events and bring them to life. But when it comes to the atomic bombs used against Japan, he goes full dark side and can fall all over himself to attempt to prove the injustice of their use on what he terms a ready-to-surrender enemy nation. And we get treated to both sides of this historian's personality here in Sandakan, marring what ought to be remembered as a near masterpiece in World War II historical writing with his personal bugaboo of the atomic bombs. How did Hiroshima and Nagasaki crop up into a story about Australian and British soldiers taken prisoner at Singapore and transported to Borneo to suffer long years of torment and slow death, you ask? Well, he throws it right in our faces with a hard slap. Bam! Right in the foreword. Featuring his letter to the Emperor of Japan, he wrote as a plaintive, ass-kissing, fawning attempt to induce the government of Japan to make some sort of formal apology or pay reparations to those Australians, Brits, and Bornean victims of the Kempeitai and the Imperial Japanese Army. And he apologizes at the same time himself for the use of the bombs against Japan. He makes sure to mention in this foreword that Americans have kind of been propagandized by decades of pro-bomb rhetoric, and they can't possibly see through to the reality of the cruelty of the use of the bombs. That set my teeth on edge, man. Really lit me up. But once into the story itself, he gets on to the real daytime gig of an actual historian And so we started Singapore with a brief battle and surrender there. Prisoners are first taken to a camp in Shanghai with old colonial era barracks and a loose regime where food is adequate and treatment decent for the first few months, aside from the unavoidable dysentery. And that sounds really odd, doesn't it? Decent treatment, good conditions. They've even got Sunday off. They've got a canteen. They've got some beer rations allocated to them. Kind of crazy for what we know of Japanese and treatment of prisoners. Sometimes they're directed to do some day jobs at labor camps, and they witness Japanese soldiers playing soccer with the skulls of Chinese and heads on spikes along the roadside. But then, of course, this kind of pseudo paradise for prisoners can't last forever, and they get shipped on a hell ship to Borneo. We're going to switch gears as we're introduced to the society of this third largest island on the planet and its colonial doings under the Brits. Their arrival in Marshall Camp was a ceremonial demonstration of the end of white man rule, a palpable exercise in that great catchphrase that Japan liked to trot out from time to time, the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. If that ain't awkward, I don't know what is. I tried to do an acronym of it, just doing the letters GEACPS. That ain't going to make nothing. No, I had to put some vowels in there to make it something. But it's really awkward to repeat over and over, and there's no way to shorten it, apparently. Put to work to build and maintain an airstrip. The camp routine is at first kind of lax and somewhat casual, but as always, disease crops up. At the start, they're still given Sundays off, and the local Kempeitai are fairly gentle in their depredations against prisoners and suspect residents. After a couple early escape attempts, we get some security ramped up and conditions deteriorate. We are introduced in brief bio snippets to a great number of the men there, and one story that kind of stuck out to me was a really unfortunate tale of a man who was the incestuous child of his father and his sister. Oof, man. Tough life in the 30s in Australia. That stopped me in my tracks for a couple seconds. Some of the prisoners come down with an odd illness called Singapore ear. I had to Google this. I had never heard of it before. It's a fungal infection of the outer ear canal caused by hot, humid climates. It causes pain, itching, and blocking of that ear canal. Well, that sounds bad. It's certainly about the least punishing of the diseases you could possibly get in a Japanese prisoner camp. As the airfield construction progresses very slowly, deliberately slowly by the prisoner workers, Japanese draft in an extra 400 men to speed things up, and in the meantime, there's an attempt to get the POWs to sign a document wherein they promise not to escape and to obey all orders given them, which of course, many of the enlisted men signed as Donald Duck and so on and so forth. It's not international law. It's got no real force of authority behind it. It's just there for when they do court-martials on trumped-up charges, they trot this document out. You promised not to do this, and you did this, so we're going to execute you. Then there's a secret radio that was made from various pieces and parts in the camp and hidden for a while, but once it's suspected and found, that snaps the Japanese army commandant and the guards there, and any restraint they had been exercising is ended. There's roundups of civilians suspected of helping POWs, and severe torture follows along with torture of the POWs themselves. And some of these techniques used, once again, reinforces my belief that in the department of cruelty, Japanese were actually far ahead of the Germans, or the Soviets, or the Croatians, so on and so on. The rice torture, where after several days of starvation, they force feed you rice until your stomach's bloated, and then stick a tube down your throat and inject water until you're really blown up. The rice absorbs the water and eventually blows your stomach and your bowels, blows them out, and extreme excruciating pain. There's also another method that involves a length of string, a brick, and a rubber tree that I will not relate here. Then there's a revolt organized and instigated by a Chinese man named Kwok in one of the big cities on Borneo. I think it was Sandakan itself, along with some of the remote tribes. They were kind of expecting a rescue party by the Allied forces to somehow coincide and show up and rescue them from their own revolt. Doesn't happen, of course. And then the expected Japanese reprisals really crush it. And then there's the death marches, which is what you're here for. Late in the war, with the airstrip done and then neutralized by the Allies, the Japanese see little or no purpose to keeping these men alive. The officers have been separated from other ranks by this by this point, and they kind of stand a pseudo chance of living. But the enlisted men are marched out in groups to jungle destinations, ostensibly as coolies for supplies for scattered Japanese garrisons, but in reality it's going to kill them off without directly executing most of them. If you're familiar with the Long Walk movie or the story by Stephen King, they're force marched, and of course if you fall behind, the follow-up death squad will just put you out of your misery, just like in the story, that kind of thing. So there ends up being a total of about 4 death marches. And by the way, of course, over the years, the conditions of food supplies and medicine for the prisoners had dwindled down to next to nothing. So there's starving skeletons when they're marched out on these death marches, and it's straight up normal Japanese prisoner of war camps, as you know them throughout the war by this point. Let's see. Along the way, Ham shed some light on the notions of rescue plan that never went beyond the vaguest ideas of operation, as well as Force Z, that was the start of the Australian Special Forces units. Going back a minute to that bomb business, which crops up again in August 45, as these death marches are taking place. Early on in the book, when he's describing the origins of the Z Force, he mentions their kill or be killed ethos, regardless of the way it was done. And he goes on to say that when you're fighting a global war, regardless of the way it was done, there's no time to be squeamish or polite in how you kill the enemies of your nation. That rationale perhaps only applies in his own mind to Australian forces doing the killing. Not sure, but it certainly sticks in my memory as a man telling on himself and simply just not smart enough to realize it. The fates of those who survived are really vivid and varied. The efforts to bring the Japanese to trial, well done. There was actually some real justice dispensed post-war. But in the postscript, it really sets me off again. I know I'm harping on this, but this is a different thing here. He tries to tell us how we're supposed to feel about what he has just related. The proper way of thinking about it, that is, mind you. No independent ideas needed. He's got it all figured out, and a note he made to himself while he was writing the book. This is just ludicrous and puts a really sour note on what is otherwise an exceptional effort to relate a nearly unknown event in World War II historiography outside of Australia. It's a hell of a sign-off. It's a middle finger thrown up at you just to let you know how ignorant you are, and then he has to give you one final bit of instruction as to the proper emotion you are free to experience now that he has told you what that emotion is. Yeah, I got a lot of feelings about this one. I give it 4 stars with those problematic sections chopped off, and is really, really good. And it sheds a lot of light on something I had no idea happened. Kudos to that, but there's a lot of baggage to go along with this that kind of drag it down. That is Paul Ham, Sandakan, and Depredations of the Japanese in the Southwest Pacific. That does it today for our excursion below the equator. I hope one or more of these books has piqued your interest in the Southwest Pacific and the goings-on below this imaginary line on our great big globe. I'm John Curtin, and I've got another meeting with MacArthur now that he's finally made it to Canberra. We're late in the war now, and I got to try to convince him that I don't want our troops left behind on already conquered islands to do mop-up operations. I want them in the front line fighting for the Philippines. I think that's the appropriate use of our troops, and I'm going to give it hell to convince them of this. Until next time, happy reading.